Hello, my name is Mike Bishop and I'm going to be talking about military practices. Throughout the Roman period in Britain, the army was always prominent, both in real life then and in the archaeological record now. Roman weaponry underwent a gradual but continuous process of evolution, so that broad date ranges are always apparent from finds. One of the best known monuments depicting the Roman army, Trajan's Column, not only artificially fixes what the Roman army looks like in our minds, but also gives an impression of uniformity that all our other sources suggest is illusory. Military organisations centred around the legions, each of around 5,000 Roman citizens in the 1st century AD, but probably far fewer by the late Roman period. They were equipped as heavy infantry, fighting in close order. The legions were supported by auxiliaries, units of around 500 or 1,000 peregrines or non-citizens from the provinces of the empire. These provided the cavalry and light infantry vital to support the heavy infantry of the legions on the battlefield. Auxiliary cavalry originated amongst horse-riding provincial elites, and their main functions were reconnaissance, communication, and mopping up on the battlefield once an enemy had turned and fled. And here are some pieces of Roman cavalry equipment: a pendant, a junction loop, and another pendant. Besides land-based troops, the various fleets included marines whose equipment was similar enough to that of legionaries that legions could in fact be raised from them in times of crisis. This was in fact the origin of Legio Secunda Adjutrix, who were based at Lincoln and then Chester during the 1st century AD. The army projected its force through its weapons. At long range they had missile weapons like bows, slings, and torsion artillery. As a result, arrowheads, slingshot, and artillery bolt heads and stone shot are often found archaeologically, and this is an example of a catapult bolt. At closer range, the missile weapons were primarily the light javelin or lancea and the heavy javelin or pilum, the latter being exclusively employed by legionary infantry. Here's an example of a javelin head. Again, javelin heads and pilum components are common. In hand-to-hand combat, all troops used shafted weapons as thrusting spears. Auxiliary infantry and cavalry had the hasta, whilst legionaries used the pilum in the same way when occasion demanded. Larger spearheads from thrusting spears are much rarer than those from javelins. Finally, cavalry had the long sword or spada and infantry the short sword or gladius. Infantry also carried an additional sidearm in the form of the pugio or dagger. Whilst the weapons themselves are rare, components, particularly from handles or scabbards, are common. All Roman soldiers fought with a shield, and it was an integral part of the style of combat. They did not just parry with it, but actually used it offensively to punch and jab. Legionaries had a curved body shield befitting their close order role, whilst flat auxiliary shields could be rectangular, hexagonal, or oval. Armour of various types was worn in varying amounts according to the role of the individual, but all soldiers wore helmets. Body armour included ring mail, scale, and articulated plate. There's an example of some scale armour here, and a piece of plate armour, one of the fittings. Iconographic evidence supports the view that the last of these, the so-called lorica segmentata, was used exclusively by citizen troops in the early empire, but that they could also be found with mail and scale. Auxiliaries, on the other hand, were limited to scale and mail. Limb armour was also employed, centurions wearing greaves and infantry articulated arm guards known as manicae to protect their sword arms. The fewest changes over time are to be found amongst the weaponry, but the diversity in personal equipment, much of it relating to how the soldier carried that weaponry, was huge. All soldiers wore belts, primarily to give them something to which they could attach their sidearms. However, the belt not only offered an opportunity to personalise their panoply, but even became a status symbol. The apron, a series of straps hanging down at the front from the belt, seems to have had no function other than to advertise the presence of the owner through movement and sound. Status was similarly reflected by military tunics, normally worn above the knee in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, and by hobnailed boots. Tunics, even fragments, are seldom found in temperate regions, but hobnails are common finds, whether by themselves, on soles, or even as imprints on brick and tile. Hobnails are also a consistently useful indicator of battlefield sites, as has now been shown by a number of continental sites. Because of the way the army handled equipment supply, requiring soldiers to pay for their own equipment, there was always a scope for a degree of individualization amongst most military artifacts. Whilst the soldier could get everything he needed from the army and then repay them through deductions from his wages, he also had the scope to buy items from private traders, if he could afford it. Such items are thought to be indicated by makers' stamps. Any site occupied by the Roman army was also a focus for vast amounts of material that was not specifically military, but was nevertheless regularly used by them. The need for detailed record-keeping meant not only widespread use of papyrus and wooden tablets for inked documents, but also wax tablets for note-taking and less permanent records. Similarly, nibs from ink pens and styli from wax tablets are known. This is just one instance where there is an overlap between civilian and military artifacts. Another example is the frequency of items associated with transport, particularly cart fittings. In a military context they belong to the army. In the civil sphere, however, identical fittings would undoubtedly be identified as civilian. And this is an example of a terret from cart harness. We know the army manufactured much of their own equipment since we have literary sources and papyri that tell us so, but it is generally assumed that there was also a private market supplying troops who could afford something a little special above and beyond what the army could provide. The Roman army also practiced recycling to a degree that is unfamiliar in modern societies. Copper alloy could always be melted down and iron reprocessed at the forge. This meant close attention was paid to the repair of equipment and most especially cannibalization, whereby damaged or defective items could be repaired with components from other donor objects. To understand actual finds of equipment, we must look at the question of deposition. The ways in which military equipment was deposited governs the selection of finds we get to see in two quite distinct ways. First, any sort of selection, whether deliberate or accidental, is a limiting factor. Thus, organic components like leather and wood, both used in Roman tents, are only likely to survive in exceptional, usually anaerobic conditions. Even bone can fall victim to acidic soils. Similarly, the degree to which equipment suffered attrition was not uniform. Because of its interlinked nature, ring mail possessed very great integrity, and consequently small pieces are very rarely found, although larger chunks, even complete shirts, do occur occasionally. Scale was more vulnerable, so finds of scales are quite common, but nowhere near as frequent as fittings from Lorica segmentata. The complexity of plate armour meant that bits all too frequently seem to have dropped off, and this is a piece of Lorica segmentata, a hinged buckle. This all means that we cannot judge the relative amounts of the different types of armour from finds alone. I'll be going into more detail about items of armour, weapons, and the cavalry in other films in the series.